I often rail against a neoconservative foreign policy. I can rail against it because I used to subscribe to that and advocate for it and realize after the fact I was dead wrong about that. The Monroe Doctrine has been mistakenly applied by adherents to neoconservative foreign policy as sort of the origins of America projecting its power outside its boundaries.
Okay.
That's different than actually getting involved in nation building and regime change. We ought to project our power beyond our borders for our people's benefit, but that doesn't necessarily follow that we need to go be invading other countries that haven't done anything to us.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. And this week, we're going to talk about something that probably sounds like it's in your textbook from U.S. history and you barely remember it, but it's actually pretty relevant today. The Monroe Doctrine. And some are now saying that there's a Trump-Roe Doctrine or something like that. But America's role in the Western Hemisphere, did it end with Alaska and Hawaii and the West Coast? Or is there still room for America to affect this hemisphere? That's the question to you, Dr. Roberts, and it's a provocative one at that. First, what is the Monroe Doctrine?
One of the great foreign policy statements in American history, and it has obviously endured the test of time because we're talking about it. But I was rereading it recently in preparation for an event that Heritage hosted that I think we'll talk about in a minute. And the bottom line is twofold. Number one, President Monroe said, in our backyard, the Western Hemisphere, North, South America, the United States is going to pay closest attention, even more so than to European trading partners, for example. And he said, as a result of that, we're going to attempt to dislodge or at least weaken any other foreign powers that are establishing beachheads, if you will, in our backyard, because that backyard is vital to American interests. The reason it's important is, the United States is a young country when he makes this statement. President Washington was not an isolationist. Sometimes people mistakenly characterize him as that. It's just that he didn't have to worry about foreign conflicts there and was very focused on the domestic agenda. But the point is that this is a bit of a growth, of an expansion of America's power in saying we're not just going to be this trading partner with Britain and European powers and eventually the Far East. We're going to be very active in seeing our power project beyond our borders. And the most obvious place to do that is the land that we are literally connected to,
right?
Central and South America.
And this was 1823. People forget.
People forget that.
We were very young, but what a visionary. And when you say in our backyard, at that point, our backyard was, well, now it's our front yard. It was part of our country, but at the time it wasn't.
No, that's right. I mean, you think about even with the Louisiana Purchase, which is sort of a similarly motivated thing, if you think about it in terms of expanding the size of the country, but having, even as a young country, the courage, for that matter, the hubris to say, we're going to expand like this. The Monroe Doctrine is saying even beyond that, obviously, we are, while still a young country, see ourselves as a very powerful country, not for the sake of lording over other people. There's not yet the extension of manifest destiny under McKinley to be, for America to be an empire. It's that in order to protect American interests, we have to be really involved in these other places.
What interests? Are we talking about national defense? Are we talking about economic interests? I mean, what was the problem that the Monroe Doctrine was meant to solve at the time?
The proximate problem it was meant to solve is the continuing concern that Americans had over foreign intervention into the United States. And just real quick on a couple of things that happened after the American Revolution. We know the War of 1812 had just happened 10 years prior. In fact, it had just wrapped up as Monroe was coming into office. And that's very much top of mind for the United States, that they're still prone to invasion by European powers. How can we create a buffer? This is what the Monroe Doctrine wants to do. How can we create a buffer so that that doesn't happen? We're going to build up the Navy to prevent an invasion of our shores, but we've got colonial European powers, albeit several hundred miles to our south, that could initiate a land invasion of the United States. He's trying to solve that. But then a particular group in Congress that were led by Henry Clay, very interested in international trade, saw an economic opportunity as well.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good thing. I mean, that can be a bad thing, but in that area it was a good thing because it allowed American industry to expand and to be able to establish these trading partnerships that persist to this day in South America as a result of the Monroe Doctrine.
So we know you're passionate about American history. I also get a sense that you love opening up American history books and seeing all the stuff that they get wrong. You know, the propaganda.
Unfortunately, it's an opportunity-rich environment.
Yes, the AP U.S. history books are ridiculous. And I have a hunch, because as you said, Manifest Destiny and the Monroe Doctrine and American expansion, current history book writers don't take too kindly to those ideas. How has the Monroe Doctrine been purposefully misinterpreted these days?
I'll give you one example or category of examples from history books, and which is largely a problem of the left. And then I'll give you one misinterpretation on the right, which is more in political circles, policy circles.
Great. So we're pleasing and pissing off everyone here. I love that.
This is what we try to do on the Kevin Roberts Show. We're having fun. We're telling the truth. On the left, with textbooks, they, of course, start with the premise, sometimes explicitly stated, like in Howard Zinn's terrible books, that the United States is this evil empire. What are the origins of that? They make the claim that it's the Monroe Doctrine, which led to Manifest Destiny, and of course, then to the empire building under McKinley, and all the way up to foreign conflicts they disagree with in the 20th century. Sort of explains itself. We're used to that trope. On the right, it has been used even by at least one modern president I can think of, President George W. Bush, as an explanation for why we would have this preemptive incursion in Iraq. And so I often rail against a neoconservative foreign policy. I can rail against it because I used to subscribe to that and advocate for it and realize after the fact I was dead wrong about that. The Monroe Doctrine has been mistakenly applied by adherents to neoconservative foreign policy as sort of the origins of America projecting its power outside its boundaries.
Okay.
That's different than actually getting involved in nation building and regime change. We ought to project our power beyond our borders for our people's benefit. But that doesn't necessarily follow that we need to go be invading other countries that haven't done anything to us.
So why are we talking about it today? I hear some people say Monroe Doctrine is back, the Trump-Roe Doctrine I've heard, and they point out to things like Venezuela, Greenland, and other things here in the Western Hemisphere where the president has not been shy about ensuring that our interests are protected.
The short answer is China. And there's a longer answer that involves an infatuation by the United States with the Middle East, which obviously persists, the United States being very involved in Europe. But the proximate reason for this, which President Trump deserves a lot of credit for, so does Secretary Rubio, is that China has done precisely what President James Monroe was worried about in 1823. It has established multiple beachheads, almost literally in some countries with naval ports in South America, and has used that not just to turn those governments against the United States, but as potential military assets and an open conflict with the United States. And so President Trump is correct in saying that we're going to revitalize the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to update the so-called Roosevelt Corollary. And we're not only going to project more military power in those places, think about the Panama Canal, but we're also going to be much more involved economically. And I can tell you from having traveled pretty extensively in Latin America in the last year and a half that heads of state and government officials there are beyond relieved that the Trump-Vance administration has done this because they didn't want to do these deals with China because they know they're a really bad partner.
And so I mentioned Venezuela. China was there. You mentioned the Panama Canal. China is there. We're talking about Cuba a lot right now. China is there. I went on a Caribbean vacation to Antigua. China was there. What are they doing, Dr. Roberts?
They are using their economic prowess, which the Soviets never possessed, right? At least on that scale, to establish political influence in those places at the expense of the United States. And so this is China's infamous Belt and Road Initiative, infamous not only because it has this evil end, this evil aim, but also because it's really terrible business where the Chinese will sell a particular country, say, a really fancy bridge.
Yeah.
They'll also provide the financing at really terrible terms for the home country, the native country, and then the bridge will be very poorly built. But the Chinese also have been big investors in certain economies. And so, for example, one of the problems that President Milei of Argentina faced early in his tenure as president, which has been very successful, was that China had financed something like $5 billion in loans. And doing business with the Chinese is not something that is temporary.
Yeah.
It's very hard to unwind from that. So it's very important that the United States step in and not just dislodge China from all of those examples, but also offer alternatives, whether from our own government or in some cases from American private companies.
So you mentioned the Soviet Union, and it seems like we had a lot of engagement in our backyard in Latin America and other countries down there during the Cold War. Did we pretty much just neglect it after the fall of the Soviet Union because it's not a strategic necessity for us?
That's precisely what happened. And you and I are old enough to remember that President Reagan, to his credit, and President George H.W. Bush, to his credit, were both very involved in Latin America. That's why the Soviets were down there. But one of the conceits of the so-called end of history with the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just that we didn't have to pay attention ever to another adversary emerging, China. It was that we don't even have to apply the Monroe Doctrine any longer.
Yeah. And I remember voices at the time who were encouraging that. It's like, now we can just take care of what's happening here at home. And that's a very enticing argument to make, and I get it. But they were also saying that we shouldn't be in those places anyway because that's colonialism. That's American expansion, and we have no business with that mindset. Is that also part of what created this opportunity for China to sort of step in and
sure, I mean
fill that space?
That third factor you mentioned about some Americans being concerned about colonialism or interventionism, first of all, is valid in some cases. And the United States, in other words, did overreach in some cases, not in everyone. And so that contributed to members of Congress who always have other priorities they can be thinking about, not being focused on it.
All right. But what you're describing right now in terms of the Trump administration and their renewed focus there and Secretary of State Rubio's focus, this isn't just rhetoric, right? This isn't just, they're giving speeches. There's a real policy in play here.
Oh, there's a real policy in play. And I know that, we know that at Heritage, not just from our analysis here in our offices, but because we travel down there frequently. We were in Panama a little over a year ago and saw firsthand the presence of the Chinese. And in the meetings that we had in Panama, it was confirmed for us that the Chinese were a real problem there. What has happened over the intervening year, just to use this example of Panama, the Trump administration has succeeded in dislodging the Chinese-owned company that controls both sides of the Panama Canal. There's still some work that needs to be done in order to finalize that. The administration has also announced publicly that they're interested, at least the president is interested, in having an alternative to the Panama Canal, which might actually be a train line running through another country. Whether or not that's realized, although I happen to think it's a perfectly fine idea, it's an example that this is not rhetoric, merely rhetoric from the administration. The president, the vice president, Secretary Rubio, and another unsung hero of the administration, the undersecretary of state, Chris Landau, who is a real specialist in Latin America, have all been very, very focused on this. And it's going well. I mean, it's an underappreciated achievement of the Trump administration just 15 months in.
You mentioned Roosevelt and this region and all the things that he was able to accomplish too. It's kind of cool to see America sort of doing good things for our neighbors. And it sounds like our neighbors are welcoming this, that they want us to be involved. Not just writing a check for midnight basketball in Nicaragua or something or Honduras, but actually being engaged.
Yeah, they are. I mean, the presidential administrations in Panama, in El Salvador, in Argentina, in Chile, Honduras, where we were recently, and an increasing number of countries are really grateful because they also understand this about Trump's revitalization of the Monroe Doctrine. It really is, Trump's revitalization is really the Monroe Doctrine. It is not American interventionism. It's not we'll see what happens with Venezuela. Hopefully, they're running their country soon and we aren't. But the point is that it's constrained, it's measured. And if the administration is able to sustain that balance of having this increased presence without doing nation building and regime change up and down the continent, then I think that this will be a very successful, long-lasting achievement of the Trump administration.
Because that's when you run the danger of getting into the Yankee go home situation there, which nobody wants. So what is Heritage's role in this? Policy, messaging, how do you fit into this vision?
Yeah, there are probably three roles that we play. The first one, which is the most formal, is to envision through our policy writing and policy speaking about what this could be. And we have talked, my colleagues over the years at Heritage have talked about the Monroe Doctrine still being a sort of guiding principle for us. The second is especially when we travel to these countries, we can connect the dots between policymakers in the United States and organizations like ours that offer advice. And in those meetings, often our presence is sort of the encouragement. It's the confirmation that these are good ideas. We don't advise other governments. That's not allowed under our law. It's not our interest at Heritage. We want to explain to other governments what Americans are thinking about this because they can't really count on the media. Yeah. And the last point is for the American media, for our own audience, we explain all of this to them so that in addition to a couple of good news outlets on the conservative side that cover this, we understand this, our colleagues understand this in such depth that we can often offer greater substance on what's going on, greater analysis for American policymakers and American audience.
So when you're delivering that message for American audiences, how is it going over? Is there sort of an openness to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine circa 2026?
Yeah, there is. And in countries where there is a very high percentage of the populace that loves America, like Panama, pretty easy. Yeah. There are other countries where even if there's been a conservative political resurgence, the left is really rabid. And of course, they're never Trumpers. And so in those countries, conservatives, whether they're really oriented toward Trump, which is usually the case, or they just yearn for an American presence there's a celebration of this.
Well, what about here at home, though? Because I can hear the critic. You know how I always hear the critics. And
somehow
the critics on the right now are saying, what are you guys talking about? We're supposed to be America first. Let's fill our own potholes. Let's build our own schools. That's not America first. Is it America first to be embracing a new Monroe Doctrine?
It's America first to be embracing a new Monroe Doctrine because what it does is improve the national security, the safety of Americans at home. What would be a violation of America first is if there is a pattern of regime change and nation building, or to be devil's advocate myself, if, for example, our country, our administration continues over a long period of time to basically be the puppeteer of whoever's running Venezuela.
Yeah.
That it is the intention of our administration that be very short term. Heritage, of course, believes that that's what it needs to be. So we will be watching out for those patterns, although we don't think that will happen.
And by the way, if it's not America first, as you just mentioned, it's going to be China first.
That's right.
That's just a reality.
And that's why, especially given the threat from China, that it's America first.
Also, was there a distinction because you made you recalled what we were doing in the Middle East, what we still have interest in the Middle East, of course. Nation building in places like that is very different than influencing countries that are in our backyard that also have roots more in a European democratic structure
and a Christian structure, and it's
yeah.
really no, I know you know that. It's just really important to state because it's just top of mind for me, having traveled throughout Latin America a lot in the last year. Is even though Christian religiosity has declined in some of those places, it's still at the very least a touchstone between the United States and each of those countries, not to mention the fact that most Latin American countries copied their original constitutions when they became independent,
right,
mostly from Spain,
yeah,
on ours.
Yeah.
So it's very different than trying to nation build in Afghanistan or Iraq.
It is amazing how many of the flags down there have red, white, and blue incorporated into their flag. Not all of them, but quite a few of them.
It's tremendous. And look, I can tell you, just to swerve into another topic we've covered on the show recently, our Index of Economic economic freedom.
Yeah.
A lot of those countries are already, moving up the chart, so to speak. Argentina, as we talked about, made gigantic leaps. That will continue and be broader based, that is involving more countries in subsequent years, that redounds to the benefit not just of people in Latin America, but also for Americans because of the health of those trading relationships.
So you mentioned your visits to Chile and Honduras, right? And when you met with some of the officials in those countries, what do you hear from them in terms of where has America been, where we are now, and where we're headed? They want to be a part of, and they want America to be a part of their future?
Yeah, they were exasperated under Biden's presidency. And not just because Biden was feckless, which he was, but it was that the policies of the Biden State Department were harmful to these countries. I mean, the reason USAID needed to end is that it had become the big vehicle for imposing wokeness and DEI and all kinds of distasteful ideas to these countries that are socially conservative.
Which is its own kind of colonization, by the way.
It is.
But they never talk about that.
It's a really good way of putting it, Larry. It's like an intellectual colonization. And so the point there is it would have been an improvement if the Trump administration just ended that. Like these people would have
just get out of our lives.
But in addition to ending that, they're becoming involved in a way that is as a trading partner. But you know what they also say? Also as a military partner. I mean, they see what's happened to Eastern Europe because of Russia. They see the threats that China makes, right now to Taiwan directly, but indirectly recently to the Philippines and Japan. And they want a strong military presence by the United States there.
There seems to have been a string of elections in these countries, too, that had tended to lean toward a more conservative politician who was more in line with American values, heritage values, it seems.
No, it's true. I believe that what's happening right now is that this Trump-style convergence of populism and nationalism and conservatism is something we're not just seeing here and in many places in Europe. Think about Nigel Farage and the emergence of the Reform Party. I think France is likely to have a conservative president elected in 2027 from the same mold. Actually, in South America, the number of countries that have elected presidents in that mold has surpassed the number of countries in Europe.
Wow.
That's how profound a trend it is there.
So in your conversations with officials in Latin America, what are their concerns? What are they worried about with regard to the United States?
They were worried that the United States would no longer be a reliable military ally, would no longer be a reliable economic partner. Some exceptions to that, obviously. And now their worry is, can the good guys stay in power long enough so that this relatively renewed arrangement can persist beyond Trump's second term? And that's kind of goes back to your question about the role that heritage can play, is that we believe that by visiting these places and telling these stories, not just for the people there, but for most importantly, the American audience, we can hopefully shape public opinion around the importance of America doing that, hopefully regardless of Republican or Democrat administrations. Yeah. It used to be that way.
It used to be that way. We keep saying that a lot here. There used to be things that we agreed on in this country beyond party.
That might be a sign of our age.
Another way heritage is involved here is this Miami Security Forum, which I was not invited to, which I'm getting over.
What an oversight. I think we should blame the president.
The weather is so beautiful down there.
And it was then, I have to tell you.
The beer is better in Munich, but I think the conversation was probably better in Miami. Is this your answer to the Munich security?
It is actually.
Forum?
Yeah. And
I love that. That's brilliant.
No, it is brilliant. And it's, I did not come up with this. My colleagues Wilson Beaver and Andres Martinez did. And they did as we were traveling back from our trip to Argentina and Paraguay and Panama last year. They said, we need to figure out how we can harness this, because all these friends in Latin America want to engage with us at Heritage more, and they want to engage with more American officials, members of Congress, the administration. And we said, well, how about we convene a conference, just like the left does? We'll do it in Miami, which of course makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. And even though this is just the first time we did it, we had something like 350 people there.
Wow.
Tremendous press coverage. The whole thing was open, and people could see what we're talking about. Not only is there nothing to be ashamed of, we ought to be really proud of what's going on there.
Well, and so what was sort of the big takeaway, other than to have another one and invite Larry O'Connor next time? But was there sort of consensus on the way forward here in this hemisphere with America's involvement and new partnerships?
Very strong consensus on that. But we also, and it is a but, we also invited officials from other countries, both from East Asia and from Europe, because the concerns that officials in any one of those regions, East Asia, Latin America, or Europe, will have about the United States is that somehow we're only going to focus on one of the other regions and not them. And so what we wanted to convey is our understanding from the Trump administration, judging by their actions, is that they want the United States to be active in all those places with a preference for Latin America, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, for our European friends in particular to hear that, for our Taiwanese friends in particular to hear that firsthand, let them understand that it's not a zero-sum game, but that when you're looking at foreign policy through the lens of Americans first, it has to be focused on Latin America first.
Is it, when you are part of a gathering like that of policymakers and leaders and individuals from all these different countries, and you're trying to reach consensus on some fundamentals, does it almost strike you sometimes that it's easier to do that there than it is here in Washington, D.C.?
Yes. In fact, we said that often.
Americans do agree.
We said that often. And in fact, I think other Americans, from other organizations, certain agencies, parts of the government made the same observation.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to get out of Washington more.
So again, asking questions from the conservative right-wing perspective, I suppose, isolationism. We're charged with being isolationists all the time when we want to prioritize America's interests. Even if we're prioritizing America's interests abroad, we're still somehow isolationists. How do you balance these interests and sort of push back on the idea that conservatives have an inherent isolationist streak?
Yeah, most of the time when I hear that, I accuse the accuser of a false dichotomy. Whether intended or unintended, it's what it is, because they basically are making the mistaken claim that because the growing number of conservatives, maybe led by Heritage, are saying our national security foreign policy work has to be more constrained, and we're therefore restrainers, that's the sort of common lingo now, that we're knee-jerk isolationists. And what we're saying is, our colleagues in foreign policy, led by the great Dr. Victoria Coates, say, we're not hawks, we're not doves, we're owls. That's sort of the metaphor that they use. And it's a little nerdy.
It is,
but it makes sense, because what it suggests is that the United States is powerful enough to act decisively when it makes sense, but it's wise enough to know that it shouldn't do it as much as the hawks in D.C. want you to. And so the second thing that I say to real thoughtful people who make this accusation is, you want this middle of the road position, at the very least politically, because it's more sustainable in a republic. In other words, that's how you prevent more people from becoming isolationists. In other words, you'll get real isolationists the more interventionism you implement.
That makes sense. Yeah, well, we see that playing out these days, actually.
You do.
Especially after the last 20 years in the Middle East, as you referred to. So let's not talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about Europe, because we have made a major investment in NATO, in dealing with the EU. Ever since World War II, we were invested in Europe and making sure that there's peace, prosperity, and security there. Did we go too far in emphasizing Europe at the neglect of, again, Monroe Doctrine, our own backyard? Because Europe isn't the Monroe Doctrine. That's not part of
we did. In fact, several of us just this day at lunch were having a conversation with our newest Heritage colleague, former Polish president, Andrzej Duda. And he's a distinguished senior fellow here at Heritage. And we were having this very conversation. And he understands well, because the Poles have been such great allies of ours, that what happened in the United States, especially after the end of the Cold War, is that European nations started growing their welfare states. The United States continued to be the major investor in NATO, and the percentage of GDP that NATO countries most were spending on defense declined, to the point that at one point, the Germans and the French were spending less than 1% of their GDP on defense. Why? Because we're subsidizing.
Because we did it, yeah.
So in very real terms, monetary terms, we overinvested. But going back to the false dichotomy issue we were just talking about, recognizing that and fixing that, which is that European countries need to spend more money on their defense. They need to spend more time focused on Russia so that we can spend more time focused on China and Latin America, is not saying that we aren't going to be involved in Europe.
Yeah.
Right?
Right, of course. And I merely raised it because I know that's what they'll say. They're
glad
going
you did.
and they're pulling out of NATO. But I raised it just in terms of when you think about that investment in time and energy and focus on Europe, when all of this is going on in Latin America and in South America that really will affect us even more so. In fact, there's a tie into immigration here too, isn't there?
It's huge.
I'll never forget. By the way, real fast, I got to see President Bukele like in the first year, right after he got elected the first time in El Salvador, and I was part of a press pool there with the Secretary of State at the time, and I asked him, what do you say to Americans right now with regard to immigration and your role in so many Salvadorans in America? And he said, I'd never forget it, Dr. Roberts. He said, my job as president of El Salvador is to make El Salvador such a great country that Salvadorans will never want to leave. I never thought I'd hear that.
Isn't it refreshing?
But that's where we need to get, right, with all the countries.
No, that's the answer. So I'll leave the specific countries nameless, but multiple government officials from multiple Central American countries have told us over the last few years at Heritage that they offered the Biden administration more help on immigration. Think about, that important avenue that Central America is.
Yeah.
And it was declined. And so they too are really, really happy about the Trump administration's focus on immigration, both because they see that as a sign that the United States is stronger and has got better policy, but also because it benefits them along the ways President Bukele was saying.
Right.
On the flip side, some of them are very worried about the arguments which Heritage supports in our domestic policy about taxing remittances. Mm-hmm. Because as you know, so many of these countries, it's like the second most important part of their economy. And we don't want to harm those economies, but one role Heritage can play is to explain to those officials, in addition to the explanations they're getting from American policymakers, that this has to happen if we're going to fix this problem. And they need to be doing what President Bukele is doing in El Salvador.
Yeah. Well, I would think that if you take pride in leading a country, you would want to make sure that that country is self-sustainable, not reliant on money coming from people who have left your country.
It's just never going to work.
Right,
yeah.
right.
It's actually sort of maybe a vestige of the national dependency mentality from colonialism. I don't know.
Well, I mean, we usually talk about America's 250 and our founding, but this is about James Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine, so there's been a lot there. So let's reorient that question. When we look back at the Monroe Doctrine and our founding, how can we apply what we've learned and what we've lived under with the Monroe Doctrine here in the Western Hemisphere forward to the next 250 years? What do you envision here if this new Monroe Doctrine or re-envisionment of the Monroe Doctrine here actually manifests and takes hold?
I actually think it's probably the most important foreign policy priority of the Trump administration. Because of the intrinsic benefits for Latin America and for Americans, but also because it has a ripple effect across all of our other national security policy. For example, at the top of the list would be weakening China. The second example would be convincing our European allies and NATO primarily that while we will continue to be members of NATO, we'll continue to pay our fair share, that they need to pay their fair share too, and they need to be responsible for keeping Russia in check so that we can be focused on China. And then the other benefit is, especially if, as we sit here having this conversation, the Iran conflict has been brought to a conclusion, which I hope and pray that it has. God bless Trump for good action, but this cannot be another forever war for a lot of reasons. Then Trump will have succeeded in less than one term in office in resetting the mistaken American geopolitics of a generation. There are very, very few presidents about whom we can say that. James Monroe would be one of them.
If you truly believe that this is quite possibly the most important foreign policy issue that we've got today, then what you're saying with regard to President Trump, Vice President Vance Shirley, the Secretary of State, Undersecretary of State, the perfect team is in place right now.
Oh, I believe that.
Through.
I believe they are literally the perfect team. And if you think about the rest of the cabinet, for example, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, when that issue of China's loans to Argentina came up, Malay's trying to figure out what to do, right? Yeah. Bessent goes down there. He's not just important, he's the Treasury Secretary, but he's the world's expert on these kinds of macroeconomic deals, right? It's a hell of a team, and we ought to be really proud of them.
Well, it started out as a history lesson, I suppose, looking back in the rearview mirror with the Monroe Doctrine. But, let's face it, it was about America's role in the world and in this hemisphere. It was about sovereignty. It was about independence. It was about fiscal security. It was about national security. Everything we're dealing with today. And that's why we talked about it on the Kevin Roberts Show. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.